On the night of September 25, 1983, a Soviet military officer named Stanislav Petrov was sitting in a command center outside Moscow, watching a screen. His job was to monitor the Soviet Union's early warning satellite system, the system designed to detect an incoming American nuclear missile attack and give Soviet leadership the minutes they needed to decide whether to launch a retaliatory strike. At 12:15 in the morning, the screen lit up. The system reported that a single American intercontinental ballistic missile had been launched toward the Soviet Union. Then it reported a second, then a third, then a fourth, then a fifth. The protocol was clear. Petrov was supposed to report an attack to his superiors immediately. His superiors would then alert the Soviet leadership. The leadership would have minutes, perhaps as few as 10, to decide whether to launch a nuclear response before the incoming missiles arrived. Petrov did not report an attack. He sat in his chair, looked at his screen, and decided against protocol, against the evidence in front of him, against everything his training told him to do, that the system was wrong. He was right. No missiles had been launched. The system had malfunctioned, and the decision one man made in one room in one night may have prevented the deaths of hundreds of millions of people. Nobody gave him a medal. For years, almost nobody knew it had happened at all. To understand what Petrov faced that night, you have to understand how terrifying the world of 1983 actually was. The early 1980s represented one of the most dangerous periods of the Cold War. Ronald Reagan had come to power in 1981 on a platform of confronting Soviet power directly. His administration dramatically increased American defense spending, deployed new nuclear weapons in Western Europe, and used rhetoric about the Soviet Union, including the phrase "evil empire," that Soviet leaders found genuinely alarming. The Soviets, for their part, were aging, paranoid, and increasingly convinced that the Americans might be planning a first strike. Soviet intelligence had launched a massive operation called Operation Ryan, from the Russian acronym for nuclear missile attack, specifically designed to detect signs that the Americans were preparing a surprise nuclear attack. In this atmosphere, every piece of ambiguous information was read through the lens of worst-case thinking. The Soviets were not looking for evidence that everything was fine. They were looking for evidence of what they already feared. Then, on September 1st, 1983, just 24 days before the night in the bunker, Soviet air defense forces shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, a civilian passenger jet that had strayed into Soviet airspace. All 269 people on board were killed. The international reaction was fury. Reagan called it a massacre. Relations between the superpowers deteriorated sharply. The world in late September 1983 was, by almost any measure, more dangerous than it had been at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. And it was into this world that Stanislav Petrov sat down for his shift on the night of September 25th. The Soviet early warning system, codenamed OKO, meaning eye, used satellites in high orbit to detect the heat signatures of missile launches. When a missile was fired, its rocket exhaust would appear as a bright infrared signature against the cold background of the Earth, which the satellites could detect from space. At 12:15 in the morning, the system reported a launch from an American missile base. Then another, then three more. 5 missiles, the system said, were on their way. The alert was classified at the highest level of certainty the system could produce. This was not an ambiguous reading. This was the system saying with maximum confidence that an attack was underway. Petrov had about 10 minutes. In 10 minutes, the missiles, if they were real, would be close enough that Soviet radar systems on the ground would be able to confirm them independently. But Soviet doctrine did not require waiting for radar confirmation before reporting an attack to the leadership. The protocol was to report immediately. Petrov looked at his screen and he began to think. What Petrov thought in those minutes was this: if the Americans were going to launch a nuclear first strike against the Soviet Union, the most consequential military action in human history, would they start with 5 missiles? 5 missiles would destroy 5 targets. The Soviet Union had thousands of military installations, missile silos, command centers, and strategic assets. A genuine first strike, designed to destroy Soviet retaliatory capacity before the Soviets could respond, would require not 5 missiles, but hundreds, perhaps thousands, launched simultaneously. 5 missiles made no strategic sense for a first strike. It was, Petrov thought, too few. He also knew that the satellite system was relatively new and had known technical problems. It had not been fully tested. He was not entirely confident in it. And he knew one other thing. He was the only person in the room making a judgment call. The other officers around him were watching him, waiting. If he picked up the phone and reported an attack, the chain of events that followed would be essentially unstoppable. He did not pick up the phone. He reported the alert as a system malfunction. For 23 agonizing minutes, until ground radar confirmed that no missiles were incoming, he sat with the knowledge that he might be wrong, that the missiles might be real, that he had just decided unilaterally not to report a nuclear attack. When the ground radar confirmed nothing was coming, he was right. The Oko satellite system had been fooled by a rare alignment of sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds, a combination of factors that produced a false infrared signature that the system interpreted as missile launches. Petrov was not celebrated. He was investigated. The Soviet military launched an inquiry into the incident, not to praise his judgment, but to examine why the system had failed and whether proper procedures had been followed. Petrov had not followed proper procedures. He had deviated from protocol. His logbook entries from that night were incomplete. He was reprimanded. He was quietly reassigned to a less sensitive position and eventually retired. For years, the incident was classified. The Soviet military had no interest in publicizing the fact that its early warning system had nearly triggered a nuclear war by accident. The story emerged only in the mid-1990s, when Soviet archives began to open after the end of the Cold War. When Western journalists found Petrov and began writing about him, he became, belatedly, reluctantly famous. He gave interviews. He traveled to the United Nations. He received awards from Western organizations. He said repeatedly that he did not consider himself a hero, that he had simply done what seemed right in the moment, and that he had been lucky that the moment had not demanded more. He died in 2017 in his apartment outside Moscow, largely forgotten by the Russian state that he may have saved. The Petrov incident reveals something that nuclear strategists and arms control advocates have been saying for decades, but that rarely penetrates public consciousness. The nuclear deterrent systems that the superpowers built during the Cold War were designed around the assumption of rational decision-making under perfect information. The theory of mutually assured destruction assumed that leaders, presented with clear evidence of an attack, would make rational calculations about costs and benefits. What the Petrov incident shows is that the information is not always clear. The systems that generate it can fail. The humans who interpret it can deviate from protocol, sometimes disastrously, sometimes, as in this case, with consequences that prevented catastrophe. There have been other close calls. In 1979, a training tape was accidentally loaded into the American early warning system, briefly showing a full-scale Soviet nuclear attack. In 1980, a faulty computer chip caused American systems to report 2,000 incoming Soviet missiles. In 1995, a Norwegian weather rocket was briefly misidentified by Russian radar as a potential nuclear attack, and Boris Yeltsin's nuclear briefcase was activated for the first and only time in history. Each of these incidents was resolved without catastrophe. Each resolution depended, to some degree, on human judgment overriding automated systems in the right direction. At some point, the judgment will go the other way. Stanislav Petrov sat in a bunker for 23 minutes with the possibility that he was wrong, that the missiles were real, that history was ending, and that he had chosen not to report it. He was a lieutenant colonel in a military system that valued obedience to protocol above individual judgment. He had every procedural reason to report what his screen showed. He had every career incentive to follow the rules. He did not follow the rules. He followed his judgment, and his judgment was right. This is not a comfortable story, because its lesson is not that the system worked. Its lesson is that the system failed, and that one man's intuition was the only thing that stood between the failure and catastrophe. The question it leaves is one that nobody who thinks seriously about nuclear weapons can answer comfortably. How many Petrov moments have there been that we do not know about? And how many more will there be in a world of more nuclear states, faster missiles, and automated systems with less time for human judgment to intervene before the judgment goes the other way?